event that we had last week, opening the exhibition of Amy Troyer, who is here with us again. It was nice to see so many people from the community. If you haven't seen Katie's pictures, they are outside by the lobby, so you are welcome to see them after the event. They will be here until February 23rd or 24th, I can't remember. 23rd, 24th. And then during the month of March, it will be at the College of Florida. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Manuel Lopez, and I'm a professor of religion at the New College of Florida. For those of you who don't know, I know a lot of people come here just for the winter months or for a few days or for a few weeks. New College of Florida is the public honors college of the University of Florida system. We are next to the Ringley Museum, so if you go to the Ringley Museum, I welcome you to visit our campus. It's a beautiful campus by the bay. It's open to the public. I want to welcome everyone to what is our second event of this public talk series that explores Amish life with a particular focus on the Amish community here in Sarasota, in the Pinecraft community here in Sarasota. As I said, the series opened last week with a conversation with Katie Troyer and with the opening of the exhibition. And next week, on Thursday, February 23rd, at the same time here, Thursday, 7 p.m. at the CARLISLE Inn, we will have Stephen Nold, here you have the information, with the talk Amish Across America, Growth and Change Among Traditional People. And Stephen Nold is one of professor of history and Anabaptist studies and the director of the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. He's also one of the most renowned scholars of the Anabaptist tradition. The public talk. This public talk series is also a part of a class, a course that J.B. Miller, who's going to talk to all of you today, and I teach at the New College of Florida, and that class explores the Amish history and practices, and we pay particular attention again to the local community of Pinecraft, and we do like visits and we do different members of the community, and some of our students are sitting right there in the room, so I know they're here. Our event today is the talk Pinecraft, the history and life of Sarasota's Amish community. It is by J.B. Miller, who will talk about obviously the history of Pinecraft from the arrival of the first Amish in the 1920s until the 1970s, and will share some of his original research trying to fill the gaps through some of the letters sent to the Budget, the Amish newspaper, by members of the Pinecraft community over the years. J.B. grew up in Pinecraft in a Mennonite family with deep Amish roots. J.B.'s parents grew up in an older Amish home, but later joined a conservative Mennonite congregation and ended up moving here to Pinecraft. His parents owned the Pinecraft Eden House in the 1950s and 70s and 60s, so some of you might remember that. And as a child, he spoke both English and Pennsylvania Dutch. As you know, a German dialect is still spoken amongst the Amish. And he has been a student of Amish and Mennonite history for years and enjoys observing the many changes that are taking place in the Pinecraft community. He also shares his love of Amish and Mennonite history by teaching now in college, but also at Santos Tiger College. And he's teaching with me this semester at New College. Before I begin, I want to thank J.B. Miller, for helping me organize these events. He's been helping me not only connecting with the local community, but also kind of organizing the class in New College, organizing all of the events here, and a lot of the things that we've organized here would not have happened without him, so I want to personally thank him. And I also want to thank our sponsors, the Mellon Foundation and the Florida Humanities, whose funding has made possible all of these events. I also want to thank Baylor's Automotive, whose owner is sitting amongst us, for sponsoring particularly this event. And finally, I want to thank Jeff and his team here at the CARLISLE Inn for sponsoring some of the events and making a lot of the things that you're seeing here possible. And with that, I will introduce now our speaker.
What's that?
The lights will be a little lower, so.
Okay.
Thanks for coming out tonight, and welcome to this talk about the first 50 years of Mennonite and Amish involvement and participation here in the Pinecraft community. As Manu mentioned, I grew up in Pinecraft. Our family arrived on Christmas Eve in 1956. It was my mother and dad, 3 older siblings, me, who was 9 years old, and a younger sister. Pinecraft was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. There were small houses, packed together, unpaved streets, and lots of other little boys and girls from all over to play with. And like me, they were only here for a few months. Within 2 years, we were full-time residents, and Pinecraft was home for me for the next 17 years. But growing up in Pinecraft wasn't always easy. A lot of people considered Pinecraft the other side of the tracks. They referred to it as the ghetto, some folks in the community, and others referred to it as the slums. And just recently, someone told me that they were out in a restaurant here, and they heard somebody refer to Pinecraft as Hillbilly Junction. Well, I thought if I had been there, I probably would not have kept my mouth shut, because the real estate in Pinecraft is some of the most expensive real estate in Sarasota County when you consider the square footage of homes and what they go for. But anyway, that was the way it was in those days. And I remember just one experience when I was in the 6th grade in public school. Went to Brentwood Elementary School for my 6th grade, and we were on a field trip, and the bus was coming through Pinecraft. And I believe I laid down in the seat. I was so afraid that someone would mention the condition of the neighborhood we were driving through. But that was then, and now I find myself here talking about Pinecraft, the perfect enclave. How ironic is that? And I created the title. So, how did I get here? Well, I moved back from 24 years in the Midwest to Sarasota in 2014, and my sister Betty Horsting, who was a manager here at Dutchman, called me up one day and she said, JB, would you like to talk to a group of people that are coming into the Dutchman? They want somebody to talk about Mennonites and Amish and Pinecraft. Well, I had just retired and I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have any plans, and I said, sure. Well, why not? Well, that sure, why not has given me the opportunity to speak to many groups, teaching some classes, most recently at New College and also through the adult community enrichment program through the county school systems, and also worked with a number of journalists and filmmakers who come to Pinecraft to learn about the community and the people who live here. So it's been a journey, and one of my colleagues for a number of these events and conversations with folks is Katie Troyer, who Manu mentioned as well. But from the earliest times that I came to Pinecraft, I had questions about the place. For instance, when we moved here in 1956, when you crossed into Pinecraft from the west, when you crossed the bridge, there were no street name signs. The very first street you came to was 2nd Street. That was really weird. Why was the first street 2nd Street? I never knew that. And why was one of the churches here called the Tourist Church? And the most perplexing thing as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old riding a bike was why were the streets all unpaved when everything else in the county was paved? It made no sense to a 9-year-old, or for a 30-year-old. And why was Pinecraft an Amish, predominantly an Amish and Mennonite community? How did that happen? And then when I moved back here, a couple of times, or I would hear that yes, before Pinecraft was a residential community, it was an army camp. That one really bothered me because I'd never heard that having grown up here. And so as I began working with groups, I decided sometime I need to find out the answers to some of these questions. And lo and behold, this talk has provided an opportunity to do that. And so when I was asked to talk, I thought, well, where do I go for some of these answers to the questions that I had, although I had figured out some before. And here's just a list of some of the sources that I used. And you can read that, I'm not going to, but the one that I used to a great extent were letters to the budget. Now, if you're not familiar with the budget is a newspaper that contains letters from many Amish and Mennonite communities. There are scribes in these communities who write in at least, periodically, maybe as often as once a week, and they report as to what's going on in the community there. Think about Facebook in print. You know, and the values of the information sometimes is about equal to what you find on Facebook. But there's also, just like Facebook, there is also some very important information there that you can't find anyplace else. Because I was particularly interested in things like when did the first three-wheel adult bike trike appear in Pinecraft? I knew that wasn't in any of these newspapers, and nor in any of those books. I knew that wasn't the fact. So I decided, I bet you the budget will have some of these little things that as a history major in college I was really interested in figuring out. And so, lo and behold, and I knew this from previous research, the Amish and Mennonite Heritage Center in Berlin, Ohio has the budget digitized. Now it's just pictures of the columns that say Sarasota, Florida, or Pinecraft, Florida. So I talked to the folks there at the Amish Heritage Center, and they said, yes, we can do that. It won't cost you so much, but I figured, well, why not? I can handle that. And after a couple of weeks or months, lo and behold, I got several packages they were email format, of course, not printed. But when it was all said and done, I had about 800 pages of letters to the budget. And I'll bet you, if I could count it, people's names, which was a big deal in those years, in the early years, who was coming to Pinecraft and who was leaving Pinecraft. And sometimes a column this long was virtually nothing but names. And reading 800 pages of that minutia was at times exhausting, but every once in a while I would find something that was really important. So my hat's off to Adam Hirschberger at the Heritage Center for doing that work for me. And here, anybody can write into the budget, but there were 6 scribes, as they were called, who really contributed a lot to information that was very, very helpful. Eli Beachy wrote in the late 1940s, and all of the other folks here, the other 5 folks, all wrote during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And some of it was colorful. A lot of it was not very interesting, but again, there were tidbits of information. And if you want a sample of one of the letters, Mrs. Sanford Summers there's a sample of one of her letters. She wrote extremely colorful and lots of explanations about her children. In fact, if you go to Der Dutchman and you know Charlene Cohen, Alta is Charlene's mother, and Charlene is mentioned in that particular column. She was 9 months old, but she describes Charlene very much like she is today. Eli Beachy we'll talk more about, and then there were also people who contributed photographs, and here are folks that contribute photographs from their family collection, and I have a couple pictures of Katie's in what you'll see tonight, and I failed to put her name up there, so some of that I need to include that as well. Well, as I mentioned, we arrived into Pinecraft on Christmas Eve, 1956, and we moved into a small house on Estrada Street. It was so small that, how small was it? It was so small that only 3 of the people in my family could sleep in the house. My older brother and I slept in a building to the rear of the house, and my 2 older sisters slept in a mobile home down the street. And the house was simply, it reminded me of what I later learned was just a summer camp cabin. There was no way to put anything on the walls because it was concrete block, and it was impossible to hang anything. So, but after the Christmas holidays, my mother and I, we walked a couple of blocks up to the Pinecraft Elementary School. This is my first exposure to public education. My mother walked with me the first day and enrolled me the next day. I walked with Sam Kurtz, and Sam was in the 4th grade also. He was the son of Clarence and Sarah Kurtz, and Sarah was a relative of my mother. They lived on the next street that faces Bay Vista. Sam is a lifelong friend. And by the way, I have another friend. Sam is a lifelong friend and would have been here tonight except for a death in the family. But I have another friend who's been a lifelong friend from that same year, Paul Bontrager here from Hartville, Ohio. He's lucky enough to be here tonight. So that's one of the benefits of a small school. And Mrs. Elsie Yoder, Mrs. Yoder was my teacher. She was a strict disciplinarian. And I talked to Paul today, and she said, and Paul said to me, you know, Mrs. Yoder was really strict. And I said, oh yeah, she really scared all of us. And she kept perfect order. But what I also learned later, when I did research, that Mrs. Yoder and her husband Myron, they moved to Pinecraft in 1935, and they were the first Mennonites who moved to Sarasota that stayed year-round. Well, why did Pinecraft have its own school? The reason was that in the 40s, after World War II, there was a population boom here in Sarasota, and a lot of the schools were overcrowded. So the school board came to the tourist church and asked if they could begin a public school there. And then 2 years later, Army officers' barracks were moved to a 5-acre parcel of land at the corner of Beneva and Bay Vista Street, and classes were held there until the fall of '58. Generally, either grades 1 through 5 or 1 through 6, depending on the population. The pattern of going back and forth, of beginning school in the north and then coming down here, enrolling in school here, and then going back north before the school was out, was fairly typical for many school-age children in Pinecraft. And there were lots of children my age who were doing that very same thing. The enrollment would expand in the wintertime and then contract in the spring. At the end of the winter that first year, Mom and Dad purchased the local restaurant, the Pinecraft Eaton House. There were always children around to play, even a few children in the summertime. Most of them were Amish and Mennonites, but a few we called English. And the Kurtz's big yard, which was a 200-foot front on Bay Vista Street, was, on both sides there were vacant lots, was our playground. And that property is now occupied by Yoder's restaurant, which many of us are familiar with. And This was a school, I should have moved on before, but this was a school, you can see it looked very much like an army barracks. This is looking west with the ball field in front of us. And in keeping with, Sarasota at that time was the winter home of the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus, and in keeping with that, the Kurtzes had a trapeze swing in their yard that you could only reach by being on a picnic table, and I was not tall enough to reach it ever. But that's me in the center, that's Sam on the trapeze, his sister Nancy below, and his brother Eldon on the other side, and then Wayne Bontrager, another boy from the community there as well. But to understand Pinecraft, I think it would be helpful to look at what area encompasses Pinecraft. And Pinecraft, this is a look at Pinecraft, a bit of a layout of Pinecraft. Pinecraft consists of two platted subdivisions. The yellow here is the subdivision that we know as Pinecraft. The pink, or whatever that color is over there, on both sides of Bay Vista Street, that is a subdivision called Homecroft. The area between the creek and that is in white, that I believe is unplatted. That was never platted as a subdivision. When I looked at the plat, and there are a couple of plats over here that you can look at if you're interested, I discovered that I knew the plat was recorded in the 20s. The Pinecraft plat was recorded in the county records in 1926, and at that particular time, Pinecraft was in the city. Well, how did it? I had never known that, and what I learned in doing some further research that I knew there was a big real estate boom in the 1920s here in Florida, and as the boom got to a peak, the Sarasota city decided they were going to annex a lot of the county, and so in the early part of 1926, the Sarasota city annexed 67 square miles of Sarasota County into the city. That put Pinecraft and Homecroft into the city at that particular time. Towards the end of the next year, the boom had turned to a bust, and the city realized they had responsibility for all these square miles, and they de-annexed everything but 17 square miles. So the city went from 2 miles originally to 69 and back to 17. So, but one wonders what would be different about Pinecraft if it had always stayed in the city. I also solved the mystery of the second street being, the first street being Second Street. When you look at the plat, you'll see three streets across the creek on the west bank, and there are 3 streets in there, and one of those streets, and that's part of the original Pinecraft plat, and one of those streets in there is First Street. So that was another mystery that was solved. And if you look at this, this Pinecraft was really an island. If you realize that the creek creates a barrier on the west side and on the north side, on the south side there's a drainage ditch, and Bay Vista ended basically at Beneva Road or at the railroad tracks, and beyond that it was pretty uninhabitable palmettos. And so Pinecraft was basically an island, and you're going to hear that theme as we think about how Pinecraft developed. This was platted in 1956, Pinecraft was platted in 1956, but there had been a previous plat of Pinecraft, and at that particular point, that yellow area was known as the Sarasota National Tourist Camp. Well, the real estate bust happened, but there were bright spots for Sarasota. One of the bright spots was Bertha Palmer, who was one of the richest persons persons in America. And she had come to Sarasota in the early 1900s and had fallen in love with the city, with the town of about 600 people at that time. She had purchased thousands of acres, and some of that she was developing into farming, and that included 8,000 acres east of Sarasota. It was drained swampland that when the swamp was drained, it created the water for the Phillippi Creek. And in spite of the Great Depression, people needed food, and that area became a rich supplier of food for people in the north that needed food in the wintertime, and they could grow food here while the land was dormant in the north. And Bertha Palmer had the resources to make it happen. Lots of money, available land, and she also built infrastructure to ship the food back to the north, building packing houses and bringing the railroad lines out to the what we now know as the celery fields. Well, how do Mennonites fit into Bertha Palmer's plans? In the winter of 1923 and 24, 6 Amish young men, mostly from the Midwest, decided they were going to take a trip to Florida, and they loaded up their gear in an REO Speedwagon. I thought that was a band, but I guess it was a vehicle at one time. And they came to Florida. They came into Tampa, where there were some Mennonites staying at that particular time. They visited Tampa, and then they came on to Sarasota, and from Sarasota they went over to the East Coast, to Dania, and they were gone a number of weeks, and they went, after being towed the last 10 miles, their REO Speedwagon broke down, and they had to tow it the last 10 miles back to their home in Ohio. They began telling stories about how great Florida was, and this piqued the interest of a number of families, particularly Dan and Amanda Kurtz. And Dan made a couple of exploratory trips to Florida, including Sarasota and Venice, and he decided that he was going to buy some land in Venice. And in the fall of 1926, 9 families, these were the 6 men who came, and there's a poster over here if you'd like to look at that further and figure out if any of them are your relatives. Sorry about that, going too far. 6 young men came in 23 and 24. And Dan Kurtz then came in 26 with his family, and they bought acreage east of Venice, about 7 miles east of Venice, and began a farm there. The farm was not successful, and they soon realized that they could not make a living, and again, they wanted to come in the fall and leave by spring so they could go back and do their farming in the north as well. And during that time, they of course heard about the celery fields. And the next winter, the families relocated from Venice to the celery fields. And that's their connection to Bertha Palmer and the farm out and the farming out there. The rich land was affordable. They were available in 5 to 20 acres, and it was suitable for truck patch farming, which is what they were doing in the north. Celery has a very short growing season. You can grow celery in about 90 days, and so it was possible to have 2 growing seasons here with that, and that was the pattern that they followed for the foreseeable future. As news grew every winter, more Amish and Mennonites joined them, and many of them lived out in the area of the celery fields. There was an area there that the Kurtzes owned that they called the Kurtz Camp. But a couple of people found their way to Pinecraft, and the first indication of Mennonites or Amish being in Pinecraft was in a budget letter dated January 25, 1932, naming 4 single people who were living in the Pinecraft tourist camp, as they called it. During the 30s, during the Great Depression, there was always available work in Sarasota in the wintertime, and the attractive and pleasant temperatures brought more and more people here all the time. There was good fishing in beaches, but also work. And in fact, most of them did work. The celery fields and the supporting operations were primary employers for folks, particularly for men and women, but women also worked in homes in the city. In the early years, the Fruitville area and the celery fields were the center of Mennonite and Amish life. But since this talk tonight is about Pinecraft, I'm going to limit my focus on the Fruitville area only as it relates to Pinecraft and the connection to the two areas. During the 30s, there's a limited number of letters about Pinecraft in the budget, but anecdotal evidence that the population of Pinecraft was growing is in a letter dated December 11, 1938, a man by the name of M.H. Yoder. And it was sort of the style at the time to just use first initials, and which makes it pretty confusing. I don't know who M.H. Yoder was, but he wrote, "We arrived in Sarasota Thursday, December 1, and rented a house in Pinecraft, which is a suburb of Sarasota, which consists of 55 houses besides trailers, and in which live quite a number of Amish, Mennonites, and Pennsylvania Dutch people. Pretty much of the conversation carried on in Pinecraft is in Pennsylvania Dutch. Amish and Mennonite population, however, was still small. Church attendance, which was both Mennonite and Amish, in the Fruitville area in mid-December was 61. But Pinecraft was growing in popularity. In a letter dated January of 1940, a couple of years later, J.J. Oberholt wrote, "There are quite a number of people in Florida this winter. The cottages in Pinecraft are all occupied," and he wrote, "Pinecraft is full." A refrain that was repeated year after year and is still heard today. And if you don't believe it, just drive through Pinecraft on any given day this week. The first people who came to Pinecraft rented cottages that were built, but property ownership became very attractive. Land was cheap. Even as late as 1945, lots in the Pinecraft section were available for sale for $15 to $50 per lot. The lots in the Pinecraft section here that you saw were 40 by 40. And the lots in the Homecroft section were 50 by 100 and by 50 by 120. Coupled with few, if any, zoning regulations at that time, residences could be built very quickly. This particular house here was a house, when I was growing up, was owned by Otho Schenck. Otho Schenck was a Mennonite minister at the tourist church for many years. Ground was broken the first week in January 1941 on a Tuesday, and by Friday, thanks to volunteers, it was under roof, and in less than 3 weeks, the Schencks were occupying the house. You don't need a mobile home when you can build them that fast. This photo here is of the Clarence Kurtz residence. That's Clarence up above there and his sister-in-law down below. They're building the house. This fronts on Bay Vista Street, and this then was the finished product. This house was built in '46, and as I mentioned, is where Yoder's restaurant is. But not all homes were constructed on site. In 1946, one man from Pennsylvania arrived in Pinecraft on a Sunday. On Monday, he went to Venice and bought a small 9x6 house, 9x6, do the math, moved it to his lot in Pinecraft, and slept in the house 72 hours after he arrived. Other houses, including small cottages from a decommissioned Army installation, are also in the Pinecraft area. Thorough research provides no evidence that Pinecraft was ever an Army camp. Not everyone waited for a house to move in before coming to Florida. This particular couple, John and Ida Plank, moved to Pinecraft in 1946 with 4 children and lived in a tent until their house was built, completed in 1947. There are also a number of small cottages and trailer parks developed. One developed by Gid Helmuth and his wife is talked about here. GB Helmuth and wife invite you to park your trailers and automobiles at their trailer park in Homecroft, Florida. Homecroft was an identifier at one particular time, and he describes all of the benefits of being there. We are within 10 minutes walk of the Homecroft Church, which was probably the tourist church, although it may have been an earlier one, than an earlier place where the Mennonites and Amish met. But this was developing in Pinecraft as well. You saw mobile homes, you saw small cottages, and so forth. But just a couple months after this particular ad was placed, the lead headline in the Sarasota Herald Tribune was, quote, "2 children die in fire here." While their mother stepped outside to empty the garbage, the one-room cottage at the Helmuth property was engulfed in flames, and 2 children ages 3 and 5 were killed. Their last names were Helmuth, same as the owners of the property, but the newspaper said they were not related. One interesting footnote to that was that the perception with people by the name of Helmuth, which to many of us is, quote, a Mennonite or an Amish name, these children's last name was Helmuth, but their funeral service before they shipped the bodies back to New York was held at the Catholic Church in downtown Sarasota. With the number of fires that were experienced, and you saw it every once in a while in the budget letters, a volunteer fire department was organized in the 1950s and served Pinecraft into the 70s. No doubt one of the biggest promoters of Homecroft was Eli Beachy. The budget scribe, he arrived in Pinecraft in 1945 and served as agents for the owners. There was one particular company that owned most of the remaining lots in the Homecroft area, and he was their agent. And over the next 2 years, he promoted Homecroft subdivision primarily through letters to the budget. When he arrived in Sarasota in 1945, the area of Homecroft was mostly covered in palmettos and pine trees, but Eli's promotion of Homecroft as a camp close to Pinecraft with larger lots increased the popularity of the area, and sales were brisk. In a letter dated March 3, 1945, he wrote, "In a former article I stated there are 19 lots sold to tourists in Homecroft, but there are now 5 more sold. When we came here this time, there were no improvements to Homecroft. Now there are 4 houses under construction. These lots are not low and swampy. The streets are graded, but are somewhat grown with weeds and some palmettos." Many of the trees were cut down during this time, and they were taken to a lumber yard and cut into lumber, and that lumber was used for housing. There was a strong demand for these lots, and at the beginning of 1947, the cheapest lot in the Homecroft subdivision, it rose to $150. And to do sort of a comparison to value today, that would be about $2,000 in today's dollars. Still a bargain. By the spring of 1947, Beecher reported that the housing count in Homecroft was 85. So there were 85 houses at that particular time. He went north for the summer and returned in the fall, but before he could write another letter, while repairing a porch roof, he fell off the roof and died 12 days later in the Sarasota Memorial Hospital. However, before his passing, he was able to convince the U.S. Postal Service to extend street mail delivery to the Homecroft area. It had been in Pinecraft before. He convinced them to bring street delivery to the Homecroft area. At the time of his death, there were approximately 250 homes and 34 trailers in Pinecraft and Homecroft. Within a couple of years, most people referred to this area as Pinecraft, and Homecroft as a section really dropped off the map. Not all the people buying in Pinecraft or Homecroft were Amish or Mennonites. One letter that Eli wrote reported the following: August Ehrenberg and Reinhold Kath, capitalists of Chicago, Illinois, not to be confused with the communists, who, there's a number of funny things in the budget, I can't help it, who are both building nice homes on their Homecroft lots, will leave tomorrow morning for Chicago to attend to their income tax matters. By the way, he did not write communists. They bought 5 more lots today and expect to build some more nice homes. They are religious people of Polish descent and talk German. Promotion of Pinecraft went beyond the budget. Ads appeared in Sarasota Herald, which was a forerunner of the Sarasota Herald Tribune, placed by Conrad brothers, who were developers, promoted the sale of a complete furnished home and lot ready for occupancy for $1,500. Their advertisement went this way: select a lot, then we will erect a cozy portable bungalow with a 4x6 kitchenette, double bed, table and 4 chairs, 2 burner oil stoves, mattresses, etc. The etc. is not identified, and I doubt that the advertisement would pass current regulations. The ad emphasized the popularity of the offer, stating, sorry, I'm missing a page here, but it went on to state that that sales were very, very brisk, and you needed to buy quickly in order to take care of the. Oh, here we go. Here's what they wrote: owing to the demand for these houses and lots, you will be compelled to take your turn. So hurry, hurry, hurry. Government regulations impacted Pinecraft as well. In 1956, and I'm sure if I imagine this was a county ordinance, it eliminated mobile homes to be placed on residential lots that were not zoned for them. So all the mobile homes now on residential lots in Pinecraft were placed there before this went into effect 6 to 7 years ago. The increased population of the 1940s drove the need for more commercial services. The closest commercial businesses from Sarasota at that time were in downtown Sarasota, 3 miles away. And obviously, with all the construction that was going on, it's not surprising that a hardware store was built and opened in 1948. I believe I have a photo here. This is the Pinecraft hardware store. These postcards were printed sometime around 1952, and if you recognize that building at all, this is where Yoder's produce market is, on one side there. And I believe that area where the deli is original, and the other is addition. So the hardware store was opened in 1955, then gas pumps and a car repair garage were added. And as I mentioned, it's Yoder's produce market. In 1946, Eli Hirschberger purchased lots fronting on Vista Street and between what is now Yoder Avenue and Kaufman Avenue. Think Big Olaf's or the Pinecraft Ice Cream Shop. It's that particular area. He constructed a grocery store, although anecdotally there were grocery stores before then, particularly during the time when Pinecraft was more of a camp. It's mentioned in local newspapers that there was a grocery store here. The initial building was 1,800 square feet, and several additions were made over the years that included a lunch counter and living quarters for the owner. And there was also a gas pump at the grocery store. Here's a picture of the grocery store. This is looking to the west. These men would be facing west, and obviously a bench there, a place for gathering. You can see the Pure sign on the gas pumps there. And this, again, was taken about, we think about 1950, around 1952. In 1952, Ed and Esther Yoder purchased the grocery store, and it became affiliated with the Independent Grocers Association, or the IGA. Until 1954, the Pinecraft area had street delivery for mail service, but as you can imagine, with all the names who were very similar in Mennonite and Amish culture, John J. Miller, and then people putting only J.J. Miller, and there's a James and a Jerome, and you name it. And I'm sure the postman went mad, and so they decided that they needed to build a substation here, and they eliminated street delivery, and the substation then became the place where people gathered their mail. They were put into mailboxes with combinations, and that lasted for quite a number of years into the 70s. Here's a photo of the post office from the outside. All of the boxes were exposed, and men gathering, as was the custom. The gentleman next to the dog facing the other way, that happens to be Myron Yoder, who I've mentioned several times, who's standing there kibitzing with the folks. The post office's eastern exposure to the warm winter sun meant that a lot of people gathered there in the morning, particularly when the mail was first put into the mailboxes. And there was a bench at the post office that became a popular gathering place for older men. At some point, someone had painted Liar's Bench on the back of the bench. I remember that well. It was not me. As was the custom from time to time, certain issues found their way into letters to the budget, and you would have this, just like Facebook, you know, one person would write something and somebody would have to respond. And so the scribes who were engaged in this discussion are going to remain anonymous. There may be relatives in the room, but a letter from March 1955 states the following. You wonder what the folks do in Pinecraft? Some men do carpenter work. Some work in the celery packing plants. Some are fishing most of the day, and some occupy the benches called the Bureau of Information. In front of the store when the weather is favorable. You hardly see any women sitting on these benches. I wonder if this is written by a woman. The younger women and the girls do housework, and the older women make quilts. Not leaving well enough alone, the next issue someone else wrote in. In regards to the Pinecraft bench, it is merely a bench that sits outside a grocery store for the convenience of people waiting for the bus, and for retired folks who like to sit in the pure air that God gives us to breathe. But sometimes some people who like to gossip and listen to gossip also spend time there. Those are the ones who know what is true, but is publishing it in a newspaper the way God tells us to do it? If your brother sinneth, to those who read about it, please don't think that all of us take part in such things. This explanation was unsigned. In 1954, Ed and Esther Yoder decided to build a restaurant called the Pinecraft Eating House. It was mentioned earlier. Initially, the building only contained counter space and several tables that served people. But 2 years later, there was an addition added to the restaurant that included a dining room, and the capacity was doubled. Before we left Pinecraft in the spring of '57, Mom and Dad bought the Pinecraft Eating House. My mother ran the restaurant. Dad would help in the mornings and evenings before he'd head off to, and evenings he would often head off to the Siesta Key Bridge to fish. And if he caught enough fish, the fish found their way to people's plates on the Friday when fish was on the menu. If he didn't catch fish, it was frozen. So obviously that wouldn't be possible to do that today, but it was popular back then. I seem to have a problem here with missing some photos. Not sure what happened, but we'll move along. In 1954, Bay Vista Street was opened all the way to McIntosh. And at the end of McIntosh, you either went north to Fruitville Road or south to Bee Ridge Road. People could now enter Pinecraft from the east. If you continued on the path that would later be Bay Vista Street and connect onto Cattleman Road, at night you might come across young couples, including one of my sisters and her boyfriend, parking and doing what young couples do in the dark. With a hardware store, a grocery store, and restaurant by the mid-1950s, everyday needs could be met without leaving Pinecraft. But things were changing outside of Pinecraft as well. In 1955, the Ringling Shopping Center opened. Sarasota's first shopping center had its first public supermarket. Changes were also happening in Pinecraft as well. In 1963, the Kurtz property was sold to Menno Plank, and the 200-foot frontage on Bella Vista Street was primed for commercial development. In '64, Menno Plank bought the Pinecraft IGA, but closed the grocery store 2 years later due to market conditions. Prior to closing the grocery store, Menno Plank and his son Clarence became distributors for a casket company and built a storage building on the Kurtz property behind the residence. The Planks replaced the grocery store with a Citgo gas station. Later, the property housed various businesses, but stability came to that location with the establishment of Big Olaf Ice Cream Shop and now the Pinecraft Ice Cream Shop and Emma's Pizza. In 1968, Christine Miller purchased the Eaton House from my parents. And in 1973, she purchased the casket storage business building, and she renovated that building and moved her restaurant business to that location in 1974. In '81, Christine developed leukemia and died in 1982. Levi and Amanda Yoder, who had another restaurant downtown called Yoder's, purchased the restaurant and renamed it Yoder's 2, T-O-O. The Yoders were popular restaurateurs, and their popularity brought new customers and new people into the Pinecraft area. I think it's important to recognize that this really was probably the first time that we saw a big influx of people not particularly connected to Amish or Mennonites who were looking for Amish cooking, and of course that's only grown over the years. Numerous other businesses throughout the 50-year period were in Pinecraft, but the one that holds the record for the longest single ownership is Bender's Garage. It's now closed, but it was a car repair shop just east of the bridge. The owner, Ed Bender, operated that business from 1959 into the early 2000s. When Bella Vista was opened all the way to McIntosh, businesses began moving across Beneva Road to the east. One business was the Giant Burger, built on a portion of this property in 1972. It had a walk-up window and no indoor seating. During the 1970s, the kitchen was expanded and a dining room was added, and it became the Wagon Wheel Restaurant. Later, that building was torn down and Der Dutchman was built in its place. In 1974, the Beneva Road, which has just been a sand dirt road going north and south and ending at the edge of Pinecraft and at the drainage ditch to the south, Beneva Road was opened and it was 4-laned. Now people could get all the way to Fruitville Road and all the way to Bee Ridge. Now people could enter Pinecraft from all 4 directions. But for almost 20 years, the Amish and Mennonite, let me just say a little bit about that. That brought on much more commercialization to the area. There was a gas station on the corner soon. Eventually the school property that was 5 acres, it was developed into commercial space. So that corner there resulted in Pinecraft's first traffic light. That became obviously a busy intersection. One of the key parts of living in Sarasota and being a part of the Amish and Mennonite community, of course, was church life. And for almost 20 years, from 1926 to 1945, the Amish folks worshipped together, Amish and Mennonites. But when we arrived in 1956, 11 years after 1945, there were 6 congregations that were representative of congregations in many Mennonite and Amish communities in the north, from conservative to more progressive. So when somebody moved here, they could pick their favorite flavor. Pinecraft was home to 3 congregations: the Amish Church, the Tourist Church, and Palm Grove Mennonite Church. The oldest one, the Tourist Church, was sometimes referred to as the Union Church because it was made up of people of Amish, Mennonite, and conservative Mennonites. And in 1945, that group, under the direction of trustees representing those 3 groups, purchased the vacant 6,400 square foot Sarasota Baking Company building that had been vacant and was located in the middle of Pinecraft. They purchased that for $7,500. The Tourist Church served the tourist community well. Seating capacity there is somewhere around 700. And their first Sunday in the building in January 13th of 1946, there were 521 people in attendance. The second congregation, which had just been formed a few months earlier, the Bay Shore Mennonite Church up near Jungle Gardens, had an attendance that same Sunday of 225. This is a photo of the Tourist Church as it looks today, courtesy of Katie Troyer. For a time, the Amish continued to meet with the group. The Amish continued to meet with the folks meeting in the Tourist Church. Apparently, this resulted in criticism from some people in the north. Facing the criticism head-on, one scribe wrote the following: "There were about 700 at the Pinecraft Church today. Most all agreed it was better to go into a big enough church house so that no one had to sit outside, as it's a rather cold wind for anyone to sit outside for a church service. The Amish helped to pay and keep up the church, same as the rest. You can read in the Bible that the Lord went into the tabernacle to preach, and it was well spoken of. Some people think that to go into a church house for services is bad. This church is so plain and nothing stylish in it, except you might say the loudspeaker. And if everyone comes in a meek and humble manner, I think it's a blessing that we can all go together and serve the Lord." The third congregation in Pinecraft was the Palm Grove Conservative Mennonite Church, and that was dedicated in 1954, and that's where my parents and I began to attend when we moved here. Once more, Northerners raised concerns about what was happening in Pinecraft, where there were schisms occurring because there were now 6 congregations in the area. One budget scribe attempting to correct the record wrote, "From reading the Lynn Haven Gleanings," which was one of the columns in the budget, "we see that people are taking the wrong meaning out of what's taking place in Pinecraft. There has been no division in Pinecraft, only a place provided for the conservative people to worship and carry out a program for our young people, and a church home for the conservative families who have made Florida their home, which could not have been done otherwise, because the Pinecraft Church is a tourist church. I wonder why all the misunderstandings. There are 3 Mennonite churches and 1 Amish church. Now they call it a division and everything but good, when we are only providing for our people. We're only doing what all other denominations have done in the past, and I do believe it has been God's will. We are trusting prayerfully to the Lord in our undertaking, and we extend a welcome to everyone." One interesting footnote about religious life in Pinecraft: in 1940, the local presbytery of the Presbyterian Church began an outdoor Sunday school program. So this was not an attempt at converting the Mennonites and Amish to Presbyterianism, but there were still enough non-Mennonite and Amish people in the community, enough children in the community, that the Presbyterian Church apparently felt it was possible to run a Sunday school program. Apparently it was successful the first couple of years, and in Noah Gingrich's book there's a photo of some of the children who were attending Sunday school here. None of them, based on style of dress and so forth, were probably Mennonite, or if any, there were just a very few. But the program was popular enough that a year later they built a church building to house the program. But by 1943, the Mennonites received permission to use the building for their use for worship on Sunday morning, and 1 year later they purchased the property. This building was vacated once the Tourist Church building was purchased and has since been torn down. The story of Pinecraft wouldn't be complete without talking about the weather and the storms that impacted Pinecraft. One of the earliest stories that I ran across that mentioned Pinecraft in the local newspaper was from January 1926, a number of years before Mennonites and Amish came to Pinecraft. They reported that Pinecraft was flooded. They'd washed out the one-lane bridge and marooned about 300 campers in Pinecraft who were occupying Pinecraft at that time. They brought food into the grocery store to make, and water as well, to make sure that people had good water and food to eat. The frequent flooding of Pinecraft in the area was due to two things. There were hyacinths that were prolific in the creek at that time that would push up against the bridge and clog the waterway, creating a dam. And the second item of concern was that where Phillippi Creek empties into the bay, there was a bottleneck there that slowed the flow of traffic. And that bottleneck was corrected in 1967. One particularly memorable storm for us as a family was what we call a no-name storm in 1962 that dumped lots of water on Pinecraft. And Pinecraft was flooded from the bridge east to what was then 9th Street or Graber Avenue. And this was our house at the corner of what is now Good Avenue and Vale Vista Street. And it came within 3 inches of coming into our house. Our house was built up enough that fortunately we didn't have any water in the house. But this was a typical scene at times when it flooded. This is water that at times during floods would run over the creek, but at this particular time it wasn't quite that high. But at this particular flood stage, much of the first or 5 streets in Pinecraft, the houses would have been flooded. I made little mention of local government in all of this, and that's because the county government didn't pay much attention to Pinecraft during this time. A couple of things that they did do, they provided bus service early in Pinecraft's history, moving people from Pinecraft to downtown for people who wanted to go downtown to work. And when I was in elementary and junior high school, Sam and his brother and I, we would hop on the bus. The ride to the beach was 1 change in downtown. It cost 10 cents. And we spent the day at the beach and we'd come home in the afternoon. Bus service was every half hour on the hour. Every hour on the half hour. Road graders from time to time would come through in the summertime and grade out the potholes that were in the sandy streets. And mosquito control would come through in the summertime, spraying for mosquitoes. And based on what was written, it probably was not a benefit. According to the budget scribe, they were spraying DDT. Streetlights were some streetlights, emphasis on some. Streetlights were installed in 1959, but they were paid by the homeowners through a special levy to the Pinecraft Lighting District. Several streets were paved. The first streets were paved in the early 1960s, 1964. And but that was only one street. That was the south side of Kaufman Avenue, if you're familiar with Pinecraft. But even until 1974, not all of the streets were paved, based on a letter that one of the scribes wrote. The first indication of a 3-wheel bike in Pinecraft, that mystery was solved, 1969. Not all the streets were paved, but somebody was using a 3-wheel bike. Some unwanted attention did come from county officials in 1970 when they came through and condemned a number of houses and trailers. Some were repaired, others were burned or torn down. Today, Pinecraft is a popular destination for Amish and Plain people. However, there's evidence that Pinecraft was popular long before the Amish arrived, or let's say a few years before the Amish and Mennonites discovered it. There's a news article from the 1926 Sarasota Herald, which I've mentioned about the 300 people. And one of the more interesting pieces of news is in the Sarasota Herald dated December 1, 1930. The headlines were, Pinecraft Club opens for winter. And then it goes on to say, opening of the Pinecraft Community Club took place one evening last week with a dance. This is November 1, 1930. With a dance. Music for the dancing was furnished by, hold your breath, the Pinecraft Orchestra. And it sounds pretty good. The Pinecraft Orchestra, which played the brand of old-fashioned music that makes the feet refuse to keep still. Between dances, several of the young men entertained with popular vocal selections which were well received. Later in the evening, refreshments were served. They listed then the number of states where people were from, the states with the number of people, and the very last one said, and one lonely bachelor. So, this was 1930. The refreshments probably were not alcoholic because this was a time of prohibition. Who knew that Pinecraft once had an orchestra and dances? Why did I title my talk this evening, Pinecraft, the Perfect Enclave? The definition of an enclave is a portion of territory within or surrounded by a large territory whose inhabitants are culturally or ethnically distinct. It's a community, it's a neighborhood, it's a village, but the word enclave really describes what Pinecraft has become. But how could a place that has been referred to as the ghetto, a slum, a hillbilly junction, and now some of the most expensive real estate in Sarasota be a perfect enclave? Let me suggest a number of reasons. First is geography, and this is the overriding reason I think that Pinecraft has been able to maintain its character. The natural boundaries. It was an island separated from the rest of Sarasota, and as Oak Shores and Beverly Terrace and Forest Lakes and the forest pines developed, Pinecraft really didn't change because of their presence here. So that was key. The other thing was that land was cheap in the early years, and buying property was easy. Everybody knew they were getting a 40 by 40 foot lot or a 50 by 120 lot. Lots were cheap, $15 to $50, even into the 40s. There was always a vibrant church, social, and leisure life here. Even before they owned any church buildings, Pinecraft held out open air church meetings, particularly in the evening when the weather permitted. And during the years, there were actual tent revivals set up in Pinecraft as well. John Overholt being one of the evangelists that held revival meetings here. Since the late 40s, Pinecraft has a strong identity as a Mennonite and Amish community. Commercial infrastructure, including bus service, has been in place, and there was no need to leave for basic necessities. And number 6, maybe as important as number 1, I don't know, but things have always been different in Pinecraft. Rules that various churches might impose on their folks in the north are somewhat relaxed here. I get this question all the time when I'm teaching, when I'm talking to groups. Why are things different in Pinecraft? Why this? Why that? And I've never had a good reason. I've never had a good explanation for it. But what I've come to understand is that things have always been different here. And after scanning hundreds of budget letters where people talk about going to the beach on Sunday, attending the state fair, going to see Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, the Amish holding services in a building and owning homes with electricity, I think I can safely say it's always been different here. It's always been that way. And maybe that's reason enough. Much has changed since 1975, and one big change is that the county government has been paying attention to Pinecraft. With revisions to codes and zoning in keeping with what many of the homeowners want, making it more friendly for walkers and bikers. Support and attention from the county has been a significant development. While I wanted to get away from Pinecraft when I was young, now realtors advertise within walking distance of Pinecraft. And instead of people wanting to get away, this is what the county is now building. A pedestrian bridge from the neighborhood to the north of us so they can get in. How times change. Thank you all very much. We'll take just a few minutes for some questions. I'm sure. Well, let me just make one comment. If you had relatives who came to Pinecraft from 1925 to 1975, do not ask me if I saw their name in the budget. Because there are thousands of names in the budget. And if their names are John J. Miller, I absolutely saw it. Yes, question.
Jamie, I was wondering what was the motivation for your family?
My parents came primarily for my dad's health and stayed for that very reason. Get down front here. We'll get a mic here and let
Wherever
you.
you want to go.
Is there one book you would recommend for people who have questions about how the young people grow and how to want the, what liberties they're given at a certain age or that sort of thing?
There are a number of books. There are a number of books that talk about folks that participate in what is often referred to as a rumspringa, running around, a time of post-adolescence when there may be some relaxing. I talk about this in my class. My class is and there are books. And next week, Stephen Nolt will be here. Stephen has a number of books that he's written about the Amish. But let me give you just a very quick how I see it. Most of us have relatives, kids, grandkids, what have you, who during their post-adolescence do things that we don't really approve of.
Yeah.
Eventually they mature, they grow up, they decide, you know what, I'm gonna quit doing my things that I was taught were wrong. I'm gonna return and be mature. I view that the same way with the Amish. The Amish have a very strong, high retention rate of their young people. About more than 80% of their young people join the church and become Amish. Yeah. But there are a number of books. I'll be happy to give you a couple of titles afterwards. Yeah. Other questions down here? When was Pinecraft Park established? That's one of the, if I had listed more than 6 reasons why the enclave works, as Pinecraft Park would have been 7 or 8. Pinecraft Park has always been on the plat. If you look at the plat over there, you'll see it's there. It's always been there. A huge benefit for the community. I mean, it's invaluable. It is invaluable. The other thing that was important was that during the Depression, there was always work here for men and women. They came down here in the wintertime, they could work when they couldn't work up north. Any other?
I was told that there were horse and buggies here.
You know what? Every time I see that in the newspaper, I write to the person who wrote that and say, where are your facts? No, there were never not unless they were before people had cars. There were never horse and buggies in Pinecraft. Another difference between Florida and the Amish communities in the north. Any other questions?
One over here.
When did indoor plumbing come with these tiny, tiny houses?
You know, I don't know. That was not covered. Most everything else was, but that wasn't one of them. No, there are a number of things. There was, if I would have not been looking for specific things, I would have tried to keep track of some of the funny things that are written in there. one of the funniest things that I read that I've laughed over and told people, there's a Pennsylvania Dutch word, and I'm going to stutter it. It's vreemd. It means unfamiliar, and you would refer to someone who's vreemd as unfamiliar or a stranger. And this one scribe wrote in the budget that on Sunday there were 4 strange ministers at church. She did not name them. One more question. What, if there is one more? Going once? Going twice? Way in the back over there.
Give me a second.
Just make a comment about property values and how they increased in Pinecraft. I hear there are a significant number of houses now selling for over $500,000.
Well,
There's an empty lot right now, I think it's on Estrada for $275,000, just for the lot.
yes. So, yes, the land in Pinecraft is very expensive. There's a house that sold recently. I was never inside the house, but friends have told me it's probably maybe 1,000 square feet. I think it's sold for somewhere around $580,000. So, you know, you get an idea. If you do the square footage, it's astronomical. Most of the houses in Pinecraft are sold by cash. And the reason that Pinecraft is going to remain Amish and Mennonite predominantly is because when you take $580,000 and you can go, you can go to a number of neighborhoods here in Sarasota and buy houses that are much larger, but it's like waterfront property. There's only so much, and you want to be close to the beach, and you pay for it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks everyone for coming. I just want to remind everyone that next week we'll have Stephen Knowles at the same time, 7 p.m. on Thursday. He's going to talk about the growth and changes in the Amish community in America. It's not going to be so Pinecraft specific. I also want to thank quickly the organizations that made this talk possible, the Mellon Brand, the Florida Humanities, Davis Automotive, thanks again for support, and also to Jeff and all the staff at the CARLISLE for making this possible. And thanks for coming. I mean, it's so wonderful to see people coming and joining us and learning about the Pinecraft community. So if you haven't seen Katie's photographs, make sure you go outside and see them. And if you have more questions, I'm sure JD will be happy to maybe answer a few more questions here. Thanks everyone, and thanks to Jim.